What's up, everybody? This is Lou. So, right now, let's discuss conspiracies and a man named Crow. Uh, it shouldn't surprise anyone at this juncture that Supreme Court justices are on the take. That essentially, the majority of them, especially right now, kowtow to the donor class. But in my opinion, there is going to be too much focus on Clarence Thomas himself. No one should be surprised at anything that Clarence Thomas does. He's pretty blatant in his political perspectives and his rhetoric. He's been fairly consistent all throughout his career. Uh, there's a lot of background information on the influence of his grandfather and the environmental impact of him essentially being an awkward yet very smart black man who didn't relate well to other black people or to black culture in America, however you want to describe that. Um, so it's no surprise that he would essentially be very easy to pay to effectively side with perspectives that seem to go against either his own interest or the interest of his own people. Um, in terms of political groupings and things like that. Plus, he's blatantly said in the past that part of his life goal is to essentially make liberals miserable. So we know that. Like we know this man. We know how he operates. Not enough focus is being put on the funding behind him, because if you look into people like Harlan Crow, what you eventually come across is a group of people called the Federalist Society. Now, if anybody that ever watches me knows that I'm not a conspiratorial thinker necessarily, not in the sense that it's normally applied in the modern day. I do think there are real conspiracies, but I do think that false conspiracy narratives distract us from actual conspiracies. This is a for real conspiracy that you can actually pretty easily look up information on. So who are the Federalist Society? The Federalist Society are a product of essentially fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism. They are the result of a man named Francis Schaeffer, who he and his son and his other compatriots, his son Frank, who now speaks out against the work he spent most of his life doing with his father. They essentially had the idea that clergy is not going to force Americans to become more Christian. There's only one way to do that, in their opinion, which is to basically infiltrate the judiciary. So young people who wanted to make a difference in the world and in the Christian fundamentalist view of things, they started encouraging them to go to law school, to become lawyers, to become judges, because that is a surefire way of assuring that Christian law or Christian interpretation of the law becomes the law of the land. These people don't like secularism in their society for a litany of reasons. However, it's my position that most of them are ingenuine. I don't know that most of them are true believers in their ideologies, because they themselves have been infiltrated by the donor class. Essentially billionaires who look at this and say, hey, this is good. This is a good way of keeping society where we want them, keeping people fighting with each other, funding a group of people who want to depower collectivism, collective rights, even though they kind of preach, like groupthink, but they'll preach groupthink only when it serves their tenets, but they'll espouse individualism, hyper individualism, in order to kind of divorce you from collective power. Like, these are people who don't care about workers' unions or things like that, or collective rights. Like, they'll tell you collectivism is wrong because they'll start to frame it as communism or socialism. even though there are many religious people in the world who practice communism. I mean, monks live in communes, like that. They're literally communists. But it's wrong for average Americans, because if you do anything collectively, your corporate overlords can't rule your life. Or at least not to that degree, unless you follow people who that's what they preach. Go to work, don't rebel, don't speak out, don't rock the boat, just be happy with whatever the Lord gives you. So Harlan Crow is very, very, very chummy with a guy named Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo is essentially the head of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society managed to get many Supreme Court justices through their filtration process. I mean, that's essentially Trump. His Supreme Court picks were picked by them. Now, I don't know if they bribed him or threatened him. My guess would be bribed, because Trump doesn't respond too well to threats, no matter who it is. He's way too narcissistic for that. So my guess would be they bribed him. And now we have 3 Federalist Society approved judges on the Supreme Court. That's why they make borderline theocratic rulings. However, they don't make as much theocratic rulings as they are making corporatist rulings. If you actually follow what the Supreme Court is doing, they are leveraging more and more and more power towards corporate America, towards the donor class, towards billionaires. That's going to be like the slow trickle in that direction that you're going to see. But these are the people who we need to be exposing and we need to be talking about. We don't need to worry. I mean, Antonin Scalia, who coined himself a constitutional originalist, which is another word for a white supremacist, because that's, when you hear someone say constitutional originalism, I would argue that those people have never actually read letters of like Thomas Jefferson or like actual framers of the Constitution, because the ideologies put forth by constitutional originalists are in stark contrast to what the framers are actually thinking when they drew up the Constitution. The framers knew that it should be a progressive system where states ratify more and more and more amendments to give people more rights. They knew society was going to change. They knew the democratic experiment was going to become more inclusive over time. They knew slavery was going to come to an end at some point or another. And what I'm saying here is the Harlan Crows of the world are people who pay people like Clarence Thomas and like Antonin Scalia for regression. For going back. These are the types of people who, if having slaves were legal, they would absolutely have slaves. Like they would be perfectly fine with it. Like they have no, people are assets to them or liabilities. They're not necessarily people unless they serve some function in their world. And I'm sorry to all the stands out there, but Elon is exactly the same. If Elon could legally have slaves, Elon would absolutely have slaves in his factories. If Elon could get the government to force you to live in a company town and work for him for whatever he paid you, and if he could develop his own currency where you could only buy things that were available in stores run by the corporation. So your house is owned by the corporation, the store is owned by the corporation, and your job is the corporation, he'd do that. If it gave him more profitability, he would absolutely do that. If you don't believe me, look up Twitter's businesses overseas and see that they're already kind of sort of tolerating stuff like that, despite that this guy's claiming to be a free speech warrior. Jeff Bezos, he would absolutely have slaves if he could. So these are the people that we really need to put a lot of focus on, not necessarily their paid stooges. But I will close today's video with this. Andrew Jackson once pointed out that the Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism for their decrees. It's up to the states to enforce what they say. So something the Supreme Court decides can be rendered completely moot if a state government refuses to push it, and the federal government is not aligned with the Supreme Court and is not going to try to force the state to enforce it. So that's why your local elections are extremely important. It's one of the only ways to make this not mean a whole lot. Think I can't remember what kind of judgment was rendered, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Andrew Jackson didn't see eye to eye, and Andrew Jackson essentially, when he was given the decision of the Supreme Court, he said, "Yeah, well, he's made his ruling. Let's see him enforce it," and that was his essential way of saying, "I don't have to do what you say." The idea of the law of Supreme Court, it's almost a belief structure in and of itself, which is why they think it's easy to infiltrate. But the Supreme Court, I mean, the authority that they feel that they have, these people believe that there are high priests, at least the theocrats that are on the Supreme Court. That's what they believe. They believe that they are high priests of our society. Well, we're a historically secular society, and we always have been. We don't have to listen to them. We don't owe them anything. So put more effort into looking at who's really behind the funding of these kinds of people. Don't get too caught up in the person that's being paraded on the screen too much. This has been Lou, on your left.